isn't a prerequisite to get employment, certainly in India. It often is a way of securing employment abroad. And while Aradhya is a much better place to talk about the academic job market, I think what I have some experience with is applying to law firms and applying to more traditional employment opportunities abroad while you're doing a master's degree. And I think that's the motivation that a lot of people have when they consider doing an LLM. They are looking at ways of converting that LLM into a job abroad. And I think that's, if that is your motivation, then you need to be very clear about that right at the outset, right? Do you want a job abroad? Are you looking to transition into perhaps policy, perhaps something more academic? Are you considering a research degree like a PhD after the LLM? Or are you using the LLM just as 1 year to do something interesting and then come back to practice law in India? I think that clarity is very important, because the LLM is a very, very short degree. People don't realize. I certainly didn't realize it when I was applying. It seemed like it would go on forever, but it's a terribly, terribly short degree, which means in that short time you have a very large number of opportunities thrown at you. I mean, every day, if you want to apply to a law firm, for instance, at least at Oxford and Cambridge, for instance, if you decide that you want to try, building a career as a solicitor or barrister in London, every single day you will have a law firm coming down to give a presentation and have a reception or whatever. And that's stuff you need to be attending if that's what you're looking to do. And simultaneously, you'll have academic events with people considering doing PhDs. You'll also have events with international organizations. You'll have events with all kinds of other people. And so I think early on, you need to decide what exactly you want to do with the degree. And when you have that clarity, you have the ability to use those 9 months, or 10 months, or whatever that you're doing the LLM for strategically, and say, well, I'm going to prioritize attending law firm recruitment events because I want to get a job at a law firm, or I'm going to attend all the academic events I can because I want to, do a PhD and become an academic after this. And so that's the clarity that you need. Once you have all of this, I think you're in a good place to decide whether or not you want to do an LLM. The big question lots of people have is, well, should I do this LLM after I work for a few years, or right after law school? I think Aradhya and I both did our LLMs right out of law school. And I think the answer changes from person to person. The answer to me is when you can answer both these questions: what do I want to specialize in, and why do I want to do the LLM? If the answer to you is crystal clear at the end of 5 years, then go for it. A lot of people told me there's no way you'll know in 5 years. Things change a lot once you go into practice. There's no way you'll know. And I don't think that's necessarily true. Because if you look at law degrees abroad, you look at the US and the UK, they spend 3 years studying law as JDs or the law tripos or whatever. And in comparison, we spend 5 years in law school, which means we have a long time to decide what we're interested in, what we want to do in. So, I mean, if you are clear with your answer, you know exactly what you want to do, go for it right out of law school. If you think you need some more time, that's perfectly okay. You should probably wait for a few years and do that. The next question is, where do you go to the US? Do you go to the UK? In my case, I knew fairly early on that I wanted to go to the UK. And I think in large part, that was also because admission prospects in the UK are a lot better for people without work experience, because the LLM is a purely academic degree in the UK. It's just an academic add-on. And so and that has an effect on the admissions criteria, which is why you'll hear people say a lot that UK universities, particularly Oxford and Cambridge, care a lot more about your grades than even the best universities in the US. And that's because in the US, an LLM is seen as a bit of a professional development degree. So they expect you to have some experience in practice or as an academic or whatever, as against in the UK, where it's a purely academic degree. So your grades matter. So just as a matter of prudence, if you're applying right out of law school, the UK tends to have a better shot at, you tend to have a better shot getting into an LLM in the UK. Of course, Aradhya got into Yale right out of law school. So that isn't a hard and fast rule. The second big thing for me was, I think, the course structure itself. The UK, at least at the university I went to, which is Cambridge, you do just 4 modules over the course of the entire year. And that gives you the opportunity to study 4 areas of law in great depth, as against perhaps a system that requires that you do a larger number of courses over the year. So to me, that made a lot of sense. The opportunity to just choose, because I knew with a reasonable degree of clarity that I wanted to do international trade and investment law, and I knew that Cambridge would give me the opportunity to focus exactly on what I want to do without having to choose too many courses. In addition to that, the UK is significantly cheaper, which is a big motivator. It is much cheaper to study and do an LLM in the UK. And there are also a lot, I mean, in my experience, at least, there's a lot more money going around in the UK. And so Aradhya, for instance, was an Inlaks Scholar, which is an external scholarship that funds master's degrees in different parts of the world. But there are a lot of scholarships that are peculiar to the UK. And universities, particularly Oxford and Cambridge, there's a lot of money going around. So some of the financial assistance I got was from my college at Cambridge. And so there's a university that gives you money, and then there's a college that gives you additional access to studentships and bursaries and grants. And these universities in the UK are very rich, and so they have a fair amount of money going around. My understanding of it was, at the time, at least, and of course you'll have to, Aradhya will weigh in on this more about how it works in the US, but my understanding was that scholarships and financial assistance is much harder to get in the US. The expectation is that most LLM students pay the entire fee, and that's subject to deductions that the university grants on whatever basis they decide. And yeah, so cost and access to scholarships and financial aid was also, in my opinion, at least in my case, easier in the UK, which is why I chose to go there. I will talk about job prospects in a bit, but before that, perhaps we can just move to the second stage, which is what the prerequisites are for admission. And so, as I just kind of mentioned, the LLM is a purely academic add-on degree in the UK. What does this mean? This means that it isn't the flagship degree that any university offers. That is the undergraduate law degree, the law tripos, or the LLB, whatever it's called in the UK. What this means is that LLMs are looking for academically bright students to pursue an additional academic study of the law. This has implications on the admissions criteria, but it also has implications on the structure of the course. So what are the implications on the admissions criteria? Well, that's why your grades matter so much when you apply to master's degrees in the UK. Because ultimately, all they're looking for are people who've performed academically well. It doesn't necessarily matter that you've done much else and not done much else. What matters the most are your grades. And that's the flagship kind of requirement. I don't know how exactly the filtering process works, but both universities suggest that you need to have what is a first class degree in the UK, or the equivalent of a first class degree. And the unofficial requirement is that you need to be between the top 10 and 5% of your batch, at least to get into Oxford and Cambridge. Is this necessarily the best way to choose LLM candidates? Certainly not. I don't think grades are the best way to be filtering students. But unfortunately, because the degrees are viewed as being completely academic, that is the primary criteria that matters. And so that's really the big thing that you need to figure out for yourself, right? By contrast, my understanding is that grades matter a little less in the US, and that they take a slightly more holistic view of people applying for LLMs, because LLMs are typically done by foreign lawyers who are looking to, build on both academic and practical experience when they go to the US for LLM. So that's the difference, I think, between the two. But it's not like that's the only thing that matters. Your co-curricular activities, I don't think there's a template, where you can take 5 things off and say, okay, I'm LLM ready. I've done mooting and debating and quizzing. I've written an academic paper. That certainly isn't how it works. I think, and I would urge all of you not to kind of fall into that trap of saying, I need to do these 5 things to be legit, and then that's what will get me into an LLM program. I certainly don't think that's how admissions committees are looking at candidates, and I don't think that's how you should be living your life in law school, trying to fit this mold so that you can achieve this goal of going abroad for an LLM. I think what matters is you need to have at the end of it, a story that makes sense. And so your co-curricular should fit into that. If, for instance, you want to study international law, the fact that you've done a moot, the Jessup, or an investment arbitration moot or whatever, that may be evidence of your interest in a particular area of law. If you've written a blog post or a paper on that, that's further evidence. If you've been a teaching assistant in international law, that may be further evidence of your interest in a particular area. But I think ultimately what you need to use your co-curriculars for is to demonstrate that you genuinely are interested in something, that you've done something tangible in addition to just your academics in furtherance of that interest. Whatever it may be, it could be, an ADR competition, it could be a debate, it could be whatever it is. And the second thing you need is to show that you are of an academic bent of mind, which means that you enjoy academic activities beyond just, getting grades and passing exams. And so you need to show, you could do this in any amount of ways. It's not like you have to have written papers and published papers to show that. You can do it by, saying I did a lot of single credit courses, which I didn't have to do. Or I did, I organized a series of talks on a particular area of law. I'm a member of SIPLA, which is again a co-curricular activity that matters. So I think that's the kind of story you need to build. Of course, there are other requirements that are imposed by other scholarships, and so quite famously, the Rhodes Scholarship requires that you have a more well-rounded personality. They say you don't need something. I don't know. I'm not in a position to talk about that. But yeah, my understanding of it is that that's the basic requirement with your co-curriculars. My advice to people trying to mold their co-curriculars to fit a certain idea of what you should or shouldn't be doing with an LLM is to just do what you find interesting. And then when you get to the point where you're applying for the LLM, reflect on what you've done, and you'll find a story there. You will naturally be able to see that you're interested in something because you did something. And that's just how it works. It's impossible for you to have decided at the end of 5 years that you want to be an international lawyer without having done something in international law beyond just your courses. And that's true of commercial law, IP, whatever else, right? You must have done something. You must have done a moot. You must have done an additional course. You must have done something that got you interested. So you will have that story. And my advice would be, don't worry too much about it. So then the final quick thing I want to do before I hand off to Aradhya to cover his remarks is, well, what's it like? What is doing the LLM like? And what are the job prospects? And what do you do with an LLM after? What are some ideas? What's an LLM like? Well, it's pretty intense. It changes a lot university to university. I can speak of the Cambridge experience because that's where I went. It's pretty intense. Again, as I said, they're very short. You don't have much time to get your bearings. I mean, you move to another country that in many cases you haven't ever been to before. You live in a new place, you're all alone. You're trying to make friends, you're trying to socially integrate into a community. And in addition to that, you have like a fairly intense workload. You have like lots of choices to make. You have to choose which courses you're going to do. You have to choose like all kinds of things. So it's quite overwhelming initially. But at least in my experience, I settled down fairly quickly. And I was lucky to have all the in-person teaching I had to have before COVID hit. So the only thing that got affected were my exams, which instead of writing my exams in person, I wrote them online, which was actually quite nice because I got more time to write my exams. But yeah, so that's pretty much what it's like. It is very intense, and especially if you're hoping to use the LLM to do something abroad, you want to get a job, you want to move into an academic career or so on, there is that added kind of pressure of using your spare time to explore employment opportunities while you're doing your coursework. That isn't the case for people who perhaps know at the outset that they're doing the LLM just to get a year of exposure to another country, to another university, and to further their academic understanding of the law before they come back and work here. In which case you have some more leeway, some more free time to do what you want. So yeah, it can be fairly taxing in that sense, but it is also a lot of fun. It's always very interesting. And the good part with an LLM is there are no compulsory courses. You get to choose exactly what you want to study. And so you will very rarely find a situation where you're sitting down and I don't want to study this. You'll have that a lot in law school, of course, because there's so many compulsory courses that you may not want to do. But that isn't the case on an LLM. So you will find everything very interesting, and you tend to be taught by people that whose textbooks you've read in law school and so on. So that's quite exciting. One question I saw on the spreadsheet was, what impact will COVID have on LLMs this year and the next? Again, as I said, my LLM in practice was not affected much by COVID. The end of it, the last month where you study and then write the exams, was what really got affected by the lockdown in the UK. So I'm not best placed to speak of what it's like to do an LLM with COVID around, but from my understanding of how things are working, at least in the UK at Cambridge and I think at Oxford too, it seems like they've made reasonable adjustments. I think people are now used to doing class online, to watching videos, etc. online. So my understanding is that they've now split how the lecture system works, and so you do 1 hour of a recorded lecture, and then you do an hour of in-person small group teaching with a tutor or with the professor that you're learning with. And so, at least from I'm in touch with a few people who are doing the LLM at Cambridge this year, and from what they have told me, it doesn't seem like things are very different, and that the experience is still pretty good. And so, I guess things are only going to get better this year on. So I'm sure things will be much better next year compared to this year. So I don't think it's necessarily an issue that should deter you from doing it. Okay, then very quickly, something about job prospects and what that's like. How do you figure out getting a job? So as I mentioned earlier, the LLM at most of the big universities that people consider as being your target LLM places, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Columbia, etc. LLMs are not their flagship law courses. What that means is that recruiters aren't coming to those universities with the intention of recruiting large numbers of LLM students. They're coming there to recruit JD students in the case of American law schools, and tripos or undergraduate law students in the case of British law schools. And so what that means is, while you are a student at the university, you have access to all the resources, a career service, you have access to the law fairs, you have access to all these recruitment events I was talking about earlier. You are still kind of a circle peg in a square hole. You're still trying to you're still not really the target audience that those firms are coming for, and that can sometimes be a little challenging. I think it's worth mentioning that LLMs are not meant to be degrees that make you employable in the jurisdictions you're doing them in. That's true of the US and that's true of the UK. I don't think it's said enough. It certainly wasn't said enough to me. I had no idea what to expect when I went to Cambridge. But having been through the process and applied and gotten a job during my LLM, I think I can say with a fair degree of confidence that you should expect a lot more hostility. And hostility in the sense, of course, people aren't rude. It's just that the system isn't built for you. The system, you're trying to fit yourself into a system that's built for a very different academic path into practicing law in London. And yeah, so what that means is, while most big law firms are very keen on recruiting foreign lawyers, and it's certainly an advantage to them that you are Indian trained and Indian qualified, it's still fairly difficult for you to compete with people who are doing well. And I think another thing that's important to remember is the LLM is a purely academic degree. What that means is that you aren't doing workshops, you aren't getting much practical experience, etc., etc. And so when you apply to a law firm and you're presenting an application for a job, what the LLM does is it ticks the academic box. At best, the law firm that receives your application says, okay, this is clearly a very bright person. They've done well in a law school in India, and then they've come here and they're doing a good LLM program. Nice. And then you tick that box off. But there's lots of other things that law firms are looking at before they recruit, right? They're looking for interpersonal skills. They're looking for your ability to think on your feet, your communication skills, yada, yada, yada. And those are things that you have to independently satisfy them of. And your LLM isn't going to help you satisfy them with those things. And I think that's often why a very large number of people do these programs with the intention of getting a job, and not necessarily everyone is able to do that. I think there is a gap in the understanding that people have of what the LLM is supposed to do. And that's a bit of a sordid message, but the good news is that not all LLMs operate the way the LLM that I did and Aradhya did do. And there are many that are built specifically for the purpose of increasing job prospects in that jurisdiction for people. So in the area that I specialize in, international dispute resolution, the MIDS, the Masters in International Dispute Settlement in Geneva, is a good example of that, right? Many Indian lawyers do the MIDS every year, and there are many who've used the ability to network with law firm partners, et cetera, to convert the MIDS into jobs. And so there are Indian lawyers practicing arbitration in Paris and in Brussels, in Geneva, and so on. And those are jobs that they've gotten solely by virtue of the MIDS. And so that's a trade-off I think ultimately you have to make, when you are deciding where to apply. If your intention is quite clearly only to use that LLM to get a job, then perhaps you compromise a little bit on the, prestige of the university that you're going to and try to apply to places where getting a job is the intention behind the LLM. And yeah, so I think that's a trade-off that people have to make based on why they're choosing to do that program. So yeah, that's pretty much what I had, and hand it over to Aradhya now. And I'm happy to do questions after Aradhya's time.
I wonder what is left for me to contribute, but very well done, Siddharth. That was, I guess, quite comprehensive and I'm hoping really helpful for students. So let me help people who are not as sorted as Siddharth is, as I've known him for quite a long time and we worked with the same committee, and are not clear. You wandered around in law school for 5 years. Of course, did a few things and did some well. Got interested in a few subjects, perhaps in activities, but still really didn't figure out that this is the path that they want to follow, or what if we climb the mountain and that mountain is the wrong mountain, right? And I was perhaps one of them who was interested in quite a few things and couldn't really at some point pin down this is the only area of law that I'm interested in, right? Because Siddharth is right that the applications would require you to frame a story around what is it that you're interested in, right? It will sort of require you to convince as if you were born to do this. But the truth is that as the law school life is in 5 years, it wouldn't be so always, right? You would be doing many things because you're just trying them out, and somehow it might happen to you at the end of 4th year or beginning of 5th year if you're applying immediately after law school, that, oh wait, I've done this and this and this, how do I really put them together? So there are two parts to it. One is why LLM. I would say there is no good or bad reason. So let me be devil's advocate here and say something different from what Siddharth has said, that even if you're not sure what exactly your area of law is, which I was not, that I could pin down on one thing. I just had a few academic interests and had no clear idea about career as such, right? Honestly. So my interest in doing an LLM was to have a year of sort of academic learning without any clear idea of what I will take away from it. And as my LLM advisor joked with me, if you took away exactly what you wanted from your LLM and went out of LLM doing exactly that, then you perhaps haven't taken enough from the LLM. So the idea is also that it might introduce you to new things, which of course the limited law school environment we are in, we don't get exposure to many other disciplines, a broader university setting, etc. So what I would say is that it could be perfectly fine to have an LLM, to think about an LLM for academic interests, more than probably I would argue for a job prospect, for instance, right? Because as Siddharth did really well and he secured a job, but it's not always very, as he also mentioned, there are a lot of roadblocks, starting from the fact that you're from a different system, but also that immigration problems, right? So it's okay for you to have an LLM if you want to continue studying further. I think that's the most important question. It could very well be so that at the end of 5 years, you're done with school, right? Too cool for school after 5 years. And you want a break. You want a fresh air in the real world, so to speak. And you want a break from academic learning, then I think that's a great idea. And I think the most important question for you to ask is whether you want to continue studying further, right, in a more rigorous way. Then that's a good enough answer. Now, apart from that, I think we can move on to questions. I can speak very briefly about where for the UK-US division, and broadly my understanding, having now been so-called trained in both jurisdictions a little bit, right? So broadly, I think the difference is that UK law schools are very as Siddharth rightly said, they were academic, but it's not, the US law schools are not academic. The law school that I went to is known for training academics and scholars, etc. But I think a bigger difference is, and that's just my opinion, I don't think that's the self-described opinion of the self-described identity of this law faculties or schools, is that law faculties in the UK are more law specific. If you are more interested in pure black letter law, etc., or you're more interested in sort of hard law theory, then these are very good places to be at. But if you are interested in more interdisciplinary studies, and UK universities are really catching up. They're doing really well, sort of in incorporating interdisciplinary courses. Or say you want to take courses in other disciplines apart from law. You want to audit a few classes from, say, business school or policy or political science or whatever it is that you're interested in, economics, right? Then US schools try to tie them up more well together. Now, I'm saying this from a very academic perspective as to you're going there to learn and where you might be better placed to learn. Another big difference is that you academically is that you will have to decide, and I'm not sure if I'm speaking for all UK universities. I have experience of Oxford and Cambridge, that you have to decide 4 courses in a year, and you study them. Now, of course, the good thing is that you'll study those courses very deeply, right? But the flip side to that is that you will study fewer courses. And broadly, these are the big academic differences. Now, Siddharth is right that there are many sort of full ride scholarships available in the UK, or not many, but still more than in the US. US model is more about financial aid. So they see your background and they see how much aid would you require unless you secure some other scholarship. But mostly law school funding comes on the basis of your financial requirements rather than scholarships per se. That said, I think we can move on to the questions. I'm happy to answer them. If you have particular questions about US law school, etc., we can talk. But I guess it would be better if we involve you guys than we just, yeah. Is there anyone who would like to moderate or?
Yeah, so guys, just like raise your hands and ask the question. I'll just unmute you as soon as you ask it. And just like address your question to whoever you want to ask it to, if you want to ask it to a particular person.
Hello. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. So my question is to Aradhya. So I always heard that for a US LLM, you require some work experience before. Now we do know that you got your Yale LLM without any work experience. So if you could speak a little bit about that, about how true is it that a US LLM would require prior work experience?
Yes. Thank you for that question. So now, before I start, just a statutory warning, right? Whatever I would say would be reverse engineering or received wisdom, because I was not in the room where it happened, which is the room where the admission decisions were taken. So I would not really know what worked or what didn't work in my favor, right? So just take it with a pinch of salt, probably not a bucket full of salt. But I guess what might have worked in my favor is that I had quite a few publications in law school, and I followed that sort of. I was very interested in legal writing, still am, and have worked in policy and academic settings. So I guess that was sort of that must have bolstered my my application. And you're correct in the sense, in my my cohort for LLM, I was the only one who was straight out of undergrad. Everyone else either had work experience, or some of them also had PhDs from other places, and or were doing their PhDs, etc. So and it's generally true. I think my experience says that there are more straight out of undergrad in the UK than in the US. But what could really help, I think, is showing that you've worked in one field, not necessarily an area of law, because as I said, I was also doing multiple different things and then somehow weave the story together. But that there's some activity that you followed through very well, which is, it could be either your, in my case, it was academic writing, which I was really interested in. And I think US law schools tend to value, which I didn't know till very late, is that they value academic writing much more than many other activities. So you can overcome your grades, for instance, if you don't have very good grades through good academic publications. But other things that it's really difficult for me to say what really worked in my favor. But broadly, the things that I was involved in is academic writing. I spent quite a lot of my law school time in legal services clinic, which I really enjoyed, and spent a few years with Aatreya there as well. I have also I was involved with a few reports of Law Commission of India through an internship that I was doing, and had a few sort of. I had a clerkship in the Delhi High Court, and I guess that was my broad profile. Now, I think what really works is sort of writing your application itself very well, right? Because that's the place where you can show why, despite the absence of work experience, you appear to be a mature enough candidate for them. So what they're thinking, and in the US law schools, it probably matters a lot more, is they're imagining you as a student in a classroom. So think about your application going to a law professor, and law professor reading your applications like, oh, I would like the student to sit in my classroom. Now, exactly what they want is, as I said, I don't know, depends on the specific academic board who's reviewing the application that year and what clicks with them, right? But think about your application from that perspective. And in some ways, I think they care a lot more about impact, is my understanding, than say UK universities would. As Siddharth said, it's sort of another degree that it's academic add-on. While US universities, while admitting, are also looking for people who claim to, or sort of might be interested in making an impact in the future. Or it's difficult for me to say how really can one genuinely show that. But that kind of interest in making an impact for them is very important. Also, it appears to me, from your work or from your past experiences or from your future aspirations. I think more than the UK universities would. That's my broad end. But yeah, if there's a follow-up, I'm happy to answer if I missed your core of your question or something.
No, there's no follow-up. That settles it. Thank you.
Thanks.
I just got a message from the SIPLA guys. They wanted me to answer a question that was on this sheet that I think Aradhya and I both missed, which is specifically if you have a year loss, or you have some kind of academic difficulty, does that mean you can't apply for an LLM? The answer is certainly doesn't mean that. I think the first thing to bear in mind there is, as Aradhya has now covered very well, there is a big difference in the lens that British and American universities are looking at you when they're considering you as a student, right? And I think the focus on academics is far stronger in the UK than it is in the US, simply by virtue of the position that the LLM holds in the legal profession there. It tends to be barristers and people who are, looking to build academic careers in the law that do LLMs in the UK. And so what that means right at the outset is that if you have slightly lower grades, or you happen to have had a year loss, or you had a few carries or so on, that certainly doesn't mean that you are out of contention. It just means that you might have to look at universities that don't consider grades as their number one admission criteria. And you're more likely to find those in the US. Again, there are people who do LLMs in all kinds of places. There's many law schoolites who've gone to Singapore. There's many law schoolites who do LLMs in continental Europe. I don't think either of us know what that's like. I don't think either of us really applied to universities in those parts of the world. But I think the answer is you just need to look at universities whose criteria are in line with what you've done and what your credentials are. Because just because you have a year loss or you've lost, ended up with a few carries or repeats or whatever, doesn't mean that you don't have a great profile in a particular area of law. Otherwise, you might have been on a committee, done all kinds of other stuff. You might have made a real impact with your work that someone who's ranked 1 or 2 in your batch can't boast of. So I think it's just a question of strategizing. To be honest, perhaps you won't get into Cambridge or Oxford, but that certainly doesn't mean that you won't get into a great LLM program. That's exactly what you need. So yeah.
I agree with that. You might have to find you have to find a university which is not centered on grades, which I think almost every other university, apart from maybe Oxford and Cambridge, would qualify for very grade centric. Even in the UK, for instance, LSE, UCL, KCL, there are many of this law universities with very, very good law faculties. And secondly, you might have to find out things that could bolster the lack of grades or whatever it is. Or whatever is the is sort of falling short on the academic side. What else could you do, right? So work experience definitely is a great addition. And yeah, so think about things that you can add. Definitely doesn't sort of close your doors for sure.
Hey, I had two questions, and either of you. So the first question is, from what you've heard and in your opinion, what sort of utility does an LLM have if you want to come back to practice? I mean, apart from the papers, like the rubber stamp that you get, is there any additional utility that you get if you're not coming from a family of lawyers? So does that help in practice in India? And second, on a more pragmatic level, just because, like both of you have pointed out, there are some things that we have to decide before we apply for an LLM. So I'm just wondering, on a more pragmatic level, when do you in terms of both of your law school journeys, when would you suggest that we finish deciding these questions? Because that determines whether we apply for an LLM right out of law school, or we wait for a couple of years. So when would you suggest we be able to pin down our thoughts on all of these questions we have to answer before we apply for an LLM?
So do you want to take it?
No, go ahead. I'll add on to what you say.
Okay, yeah. So as I said, I think, and sorry, it might sound a bit not clear answer as to when to pin down, but I think the most important part, and I think that's one of the best reasons to not do an LLM, is that sometimes you can get jaded and quite tired with academic space, right? You just need to go to sort of take a break from academic space, and that's, I think, a very good reason, and that's what you have to figure out when you're. I was not decided till the end of my 4th year if I'm definitely going to apply next year, and in the beginning of 5th year, I was of course doing many other things which ultimately became part of my LLM application, but I was not necessarily doing them with the perspective of all this will lead to an LLM. For instance, a lot of my publications happened in the beginning of 5th year because probably the first vacation, and suddenly decided I want to apply, I should have publications. So what should I do? I had these good projects which I had written in past 4 years, changed them a little bit in a couple of months, sent all of them for publications together, and somehow I had good projects written, but just that I was not converting them into official publications because I was not decided to apply that. So what I would say is that there's no one point that you should sort of decide in 3rd year, 4th year, because law school trajectory itself evolves. You might find some internship in 4th year, which you really got hooked on. Like, I really want to work here for a few years before I do anything else, right? So what I would recommend is decide sort of in the end of 4th or beginning of 5th year, right? That's the time when you will have to think about applications, etc. Is whether you definitely want to go ahead or not. A few things that help is that always have a few things which you can quickly convert into an LLM app entry, right? Most importantly, of course, if you're applying immediately after law school, because then it's difficult to overcome with work experience, etc., or grades. So just to always have in the back of your mind that at some point you might be applying, so have decent grades. that might help, right? And if not that, then it's probably better to wait for a few years to get better funding opportunities, or just apply later. But I think the most important bit is to figure out sort of the opportunity cost of doing and not doing an LLM, which is, if you're not doing, then what else are you doing, right? And if you want to do that, that's the most important. It really depends from person to person. I know people who are very sure about applying, and they went on an internship in the 5th year, and they're like, no, I just loved it. I definitely want to work here before a few years. I don't think I'm looking forward to LLM more than working here, right? So keep an open mind about those options as well. And if you think there's something you really want to do after 5th year and not lined up, something else is not lined up, and if you want to be in an academic setting for another year, you don't mind doing that, then it's good idea to then start thinking about applying.
Okay, yeah. Not much to add on, but just perhaps to also get to that first question about the utility of an LLM if you want to come back to India and practice. I don't think either of us are particularly qualified to answer that question because we haven't come back to practice. At least I personally don't intend to for the immediate future. So I wasn't looking at the LLM from that perspective, and I don't know how it works. But I mean, I'd say that's perhaps certainly not the right way to look at the application itself, because I think in my personal experience, what I learned in those 9 years is going to be useful for as long as I work in those areas of law. So as long as I am an international trade, investment, commercial lawyer, what I learned at Cambridge will be very, very, very useful. And I think that's perhaps the better way to look at the LLM. Is it going to give you, are you going to get clients that you otherwise wouldn't have gotten as an independent litigator because perhaps you're otherwise, bogged down by not having a family background in the law? I don't know. I can't answer that question because I'm not one of the people who's done that. There are many other people from law school who've done LLMs and come back and are litigating, so they may be better placed to do that. But I can say with some degree of certainty that you will often come across issues in practice that very closely resemble issues that you considered on the LLM, particularly if you're doing the Oxbridge model, which is 4 courses in great depth. I can't think of an issue that would come up in one of those areas that I haven't at some point in some way considered over the course of my LLM year. So in that sense, yeah, it's useful. When did I end up deciding that I want to do one? I think for me, it was a bit of a chicken and egg question, really. I knew at some point I got exposed to a lot of trade investment law stuff, and then it kind of became a self-fulfilling prophecy because I was like, oh, this is interesting, so I did more of it. And by the end of my 4th year, I kind of knew that this is the area that I want to specialize in, and more importantly, is an area I want to work in. And so in my case, I knew that I'd want to study it. And in fact, I knew which university I'd want to go to study it in also, because that's the kind of second level filtration that you need to do once you decide what you want to study, which is, where are the academics best to study trade investment law or commercial law or public law, whatever it is. And so in my case, I think because I had a reasonable amount of clarity with respect to what I wanted to study, where I want to work, what I want to do, and I saw that the LLM slotted perfectly into those plans, I decided to apply. But as Aradhya said, things work very differently for different people. It's very often you either don't have that clarity or you're so clear that you just want to start working and you don't want to waste your time doing an LLM right now. So I don't think there is a clear answer. I think it depends on where you are.
So sorry, I forgot to respond to the first question, and very quickly, and this is received wisdom, as Siddharth rightly said, I'm not qualified to say it my own, but from what I've heard from my seniors, my friends who have used it, is that there are 2 ways it could be useful. And there is one way in which it's definitely not useful, which is very tangible subject matter knowledge. As a senior of mine used to say, if you have an LLM, you're coming back and practicing in Delhi trial courts, you are learning hydraulics for a plumber's job, right? Now, which means that it's not going to give you very specific knowledge, which you could use very transactionally in everyday practice. Definitely not. You don't need an LLM for that. It could be useful in 2 intangible ways, which is One that for at least first 2 years of your practice, you could use your name to get some to get entry into some in some networks, etc. Right, which is very intangible. You don't know how it will be useful, etc. Second is, as Siddharth rightly said, that there is something about deep academic learning that can help you become sort of a better legal thinker, which you might intangibly use in your practice. It's not directly making you better litigator. It's just creating it's sort of helping you build one of the skills of a litigator, which is sort of very deep learning and thinking about law in a deeper way, which might help you strategically in some case, etc. But there's no tangible way it's directly helping you. So yeah, you're broadly correct. It's not training you to be a litigator. I took a clinic in when I was doing my LLM, and you could say, oh yeah, clinics can help you develop those practical skills, but really, if you're coming back to India, those practical skills you're building is in the US setting and in the UK setting, and also this practical skills here you will need is more of a temperamental skill, which you will only build when you are in those spaces. But that's it.
Got it. Thanks.
I guess there's a question in the chat, like, I guess Aatreya will be best suited to answer it. Like, is there a difference between an Oxford BCL and a traditional LLM?
Oh, no, there isn't. It's one of the many strange quirks of Oxford and Cambridge. And so when you go there, you'll see that those universities are just so old that lots of things work differently there. So historically, the master's degree in law was called the BCL at Oxford and the LLB at Cambridge. That was the master's degree, the one-year master's. At some point, Cambridge realized it's very confusing to call a master's degree LLB. So they started calling the master's degree in LLM, but Oxford just never changed the name. So the BCL is the exact same as an LLM. Yeah.
Hi, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I had a question for both of you. So in case you're interested in a niche and a very specific area that might not be offered by a large number of universities. So in such a situation, should you prioritize on universities that offer that specific area, or should you look at the brand name and go for, say, a tier 1 university like Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, etc.? So according to you, what should one prioritize? Because from what I've heard, the brand value of the university really helps post LLM, whether you're looking at it from a job perspective or otherwise from the perspective of making connections, etc. So according to you, what should one prioritize?
I think the answer depends on two things. It depends A, on what you're using the LLM for, and B, depends on which niche area you're talking about. So on the first issue, I think what matters is whether you're looking to study that area of law just because you're interested and you want to perhaps move into a more generalist job after that. So for instance, you're in sports law. And so you say, look, I want to do a year-long sports law master's, but I want to come back and litigate in the courts in India. I don't want to work for a sports law firm in some part of the world. And if then, I mean, it depends entirely. The trade-off between the brand name and the content of the course itself depends entirely on how you're looking to use the LLM. If you are looking at getting a job, or you're looking to kind of build a career in that niche area of interest, my advice would be don't fall for a brand name. Do what's more relevant to what you want to do. Because ultimately, I mean, if you want to be a sports lawyer and you end up doing courses in IP and commercial contracts and competition law, perhaps they're tangentially relevant to what a sports lawyer's practice is, but they certainly aren't in that small niche area of practice. They certainly aren't as valuable as actual training in that area of law. And so my advice would be that in those cases, you should perhaps look at the more specialized program with more as being the more beneficial program. On the second criteria, I think this changes a lot depending on what area of niche specialization you're in. Of course, I can't speak to most of them. My area of interest is anything but niche. It's terribly mainstream. And so that means that there's lots of people doing arbitration, international law. It's not. I never really built an interest in something niche like sports law, but my understanding from a few friends from other law schools, etc., who, and I'm only speaking of sports law because that's the one niche area I know a few people pursuing. My understanding is that job opportunities, etc., are also more available to people who do those specific courses, because it's a very small community of people who practice it, and so quite often the top practitioners are also people teaching in the few specialized master's courses that there are on those areas of law. And so what that means is if you want to get a job at a sports law firm, it's best you do a specialized sports law LLM, because your professors will likely be also the top practitioners of sports law in continental Europe or whatever. And then that gives you access to them, and that helps you get a job as a sports lawyer. Again, this is completely secondhand. My area of interest is not niche. I didn't really consider the more niche LLM programs for that reason. But yeah, that's my understanding of it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. There will just be another factor as to how certain you are of that niche area that you want to be in, right? Which is that, and I'm speaking that also as sort of part of self-reflection, because there have been different points of time when I was in law school where specific niche areas look very interesting, as if I'm very certain about it, and they changed very quickly. So more than the brand value, I think your question might be, should I go to more niche programs or more generalist programs where you could probably do one course on that niche area? Not brand value as much as sort of better general programs. What I would say is, if you're very sure about the niche area you want to go for, then go ahead. If you're interested in it, but you also want to explore a little bit, it's probably better to go to a more generalist place where you can do other things as well. That's it.
Thank you so much.
Hi, good evening. I had two questions. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes.
I had two questions. One, what is the ideal number of universities one should make applications to? And second, what are the English tests or any other requirements that we have to write? And since you know the law school curriculum, at what point should we write those tests?
Okay, I can do that. I don't think there's an ideal number. I think it depends entirely on your appetite, how much of it you can. I mean, I think what you should know is that it's not a particularly easy process to apply, because you apply to universities and you apply for scholarships, and each time you apply you have to write a statement that's tailored to the university or the scholarship you're applying to, and there's a lot of self-reflection, and then you have to arrange for people to write tailor-made recommendation letters for the university you're applying to. I think that's a bit of an underdog, that people don't realize how much of a hassle it is to get 2 or 3 professors in law school to write well thought out, independently constructed recommendation letter that is tailored to the university that you're applying to. And so because you have all these kind of logistical constraints, I'd say certainly don't apply to like 10 universities, because you're not going to find people to write you 10 recommendation letters. They're all going to be terrible if you find someone to write. And also I think what you need to do is apply this process and filter it down and say, okay, these are the universities I really want to study at. In my case, because I ruled out studying in the US because it didn't fit in with my job plans, nor did it financially make much sense. I knew I wanted to study in the UK, and I literally applied only to Oxford and Cambridge. And I knew of the two that I wanted to go to Cambridge more because I wanted to study international law. You may want to give yourself a little more kind of leeway to make choices once you've gotten acceptances. But bear in mind that there are a lot of these logistical constraints. It's quite taxing to write an LLM application. And after that, you've got to chase people to get your transcripts, to write your recommendation letters and so on. And so bear that in mind when you're making applications.
So more than the number, let me sort of just give, probably you didn't ask for that advice, but probably unsolicited, is don't rush for many schools in the first go, unless you really just want to finish off your LLM immediately. So I would say say 10 schools, right? You are happy to go to, but out of them 10, you definitely will have a preference for like whatever, first top 3, top 4. And I would only say if you're applying the first go, say immediately in your 5th year, only apply to, like I applied to only 3, and just apply to the limited schools that you would want to go to, right? So I decided early on that my preference would be Yale, Oxford, Cambridge, and I would like to go to many other schools, and I'd be very happy to go to many other great law schools. But I'm happy not going there immediately. I'm happy applying next year probably, because the first shot I want to give, I want to sort of give my best to my top preferences. Yeah. So that's what I would recommend to you. More than the number of schools, just decide which are the schools which are your top priority, and in the first go at least apply to them. Unless you just want to finish off immediately and you're happy waiting for a year and probably doing LLM after a year or 2 years after work experience. That's what my plan was, to apply to them. If I don't get into them now, then probably apply to my sort of second basket in a year or 2 years or something like that. So don't rush for all 10 in the first go, especially if you're applying immediately, or if you're happy to defer your LLM by a year or 2 years or something.
Was there a second question? I can't remember.
Hi, yeah, I couldn't unmute for some reason. Yeah, I was wondering if there is a requirement of writing certain English tests, both in the US or the UK.
Yes, there is. So there is Toefl, which I think now all UK universities also accept. They used to have a different test earlier. So they're basically just Toefl exam. What you could do is many universities are sometimes, if you write to them in advance and request, they might be good with it. And sometimes you can apply without the test. And once you are selected, university will ask you to take their own different test. You could make a request on the basis of it could just be a financial reason that it's just too expensive for you to write, right? And you could try that. But when should you take the test? I think a couple of months before application. Don't take it early on, because the tests would only be valid for 2 years. So don't take it in the 3rd year or 4th year or something like that. I would recommend take it in the beginning of 5th year, or some like a few months before application. Yeah, it will. That would be the good time, I think, because then it will be valid for another year in case you decide to apply next year.
Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Oh, did Anshul have one more question, or like you forgot to?
No,
lower your
I did
hand?
have one more question.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I know a fair bit about the career opportunities that a UK LLM allows, but my question is more towards Aradhya. So what are the career opportunities that a US LLM would allow in terms of maybe US law firms? So I hear a lot of law schoolites, NLS people in Allen and Overy, lots of UK law firms, but I hardly hear of any in US law firms. So is there a specific reason for that? And would a US LLM allow for, on the one hand, law firm opportunities in the US, and on the other hand, let's say if I want to then go and practice in UK, is a US LLM, would a US LLM also permit that, in case you know about that as well?
Yeah, I mean, it won't commit that for sure, but yeah. So there are two things. I mean, I was not looking for sort of working in the US, so I'm only speaking this secondhand sort of received wisdom from my friends, right? Uh, so yes, there are job opportunities available in the US. It's not like there are many people, many Indians who do LLMs and stay back and sort of join law firms there. A big problem in the US, more than securing a job, is the immigration problem. So you only have visa for the first year, and then after first year, it's a lottery system, and you just don't know if your H-1B will be approved or not. So what happens in that case is that many US law firms transfer you. If you secure a job in the US and if they want to retain you, then they probably, I know people who came to London to work after that, in the US law firm's office. I know people who go to like other European places, sometimes to Singapore. Just our US law firms have offices in different places because US immigration is difficult. They'll place your one lawyer in some other office. I know quite a few people who have done US LLMs and come to London for jobs, particularly in the US law firms, which are entering a lot in London now. Aatreya would know a lot about this. But I think a bigger problem in the US in the long term, if you want to sort of have a long-term career in the US, is the immigration problem, which is what sort of deters many people from taking or Indians particularly because of H1B sort of queue that it is have. And so that's a problem. But I think London job markets are equally open to you after US LLMs. It's different though that if you're in the UK, you're likely to access them easier, right? So you are also likely to access many more London UK based firms. If you're doing a UK LLM, you'll end up meeting in different events that law societies are organizing, things like those. Or you could do an internship while you're doing a UK LLM here in London, which might be a bit difficult to come through. And US law schools are sort of there definitely is a preference for people who have done JDs because they've studied 3-year law in the US, right? You are only studying, even if you're doing completely US law centered work, you will only be studying for a year, while someone who's doing JD will have 3 years to sort of. So they will definitely have preference for those. That said, many LLMs do to secure jobs.
Got it. Thank you.
Is there anyone?
I guess Jyotsna had a question.
We can't hear you, Jyotsna.
Can't hear you. Do you want to put your question in the chat?
We can come back to Jyotsna. I guess Shailaja also had a question. You can address that in the meantime.
Okay, I think Jyotsna's typing hers in the chat, so we could do that.
The next hand up could ask question is, who is this Shailaja?
Oh, she says, am I audible?
No. No, we can't hear you.
No, you're muted. Yeah. You can put your question in the chat too, maybe. Okay. Jyotsna's question is, with respect to academic letters of recommendation, I've recently heard from secondhand sources that it's better to get academic letters of recommendation from regularized profs at NLS rather than seminar profs. Do you know if there's a preference? Okay, so in my experience, what's important is that the professor knows you very well. A, that the professor knows you very well, and B, that they have some standing as an academic. So they needn't necessarily be professors at law school. They need to be academics, have some standing, that have observed you in a classroom setting or something else for a long time before you make your application. So as a result, it's quite likely that only professors at law school who teach you 2 or 3 courses or perhaps you act as teaching assistants for, or so on. It's quite likely that those are people who fulfill those criteria, which is why in practice, it's unlikely that you would want a seminar professor who probably takes one like our course for you. Unlikely you'd want them to write a letter for you. I mean, it's ultimately, I don't think there is a preference as such, as long as they are, respected enough as academics such that the university believes their recommendation of you. And that is the case with your seminar professors, but it's just a question of how much time they spend with you and how well they can describe your abilities.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, don't go for the person, go for the content that you think they're likely to write for you. So it's okay in many universities, professors don't write recommendations because your direct contact is actually with sometimes PhD students who are your tutors and who are spending most time with you because they are checking your essays, etc. So if an undergrad from Oxford and Cambridge, for instance, are applying for their own masters, very likely at least one of their referee is likely to be a PhD student tutor, for instance, right? Who definitely are not tenured professors or anything, but just that they have observed you closely. So I'd say go for someone who's likely to write good recommendation for you and more about you than someone who is very high standing.
One more. I just had a very basic question. So while we are in law school, is there any specific GPA or internship you should ideally be aspiring for, considering that some of these law schools give a lot of weightage to academics and work experience? I mean, I guess as we've covered, I think the big difference between the US and the UK is that British law schools are very insistent on good grades because the L.L.M is a predominantly academic course at British University. So, there isn't like a magic cutoff beyond which you will get in and under which you won't get in. But the official, it's best to kind of go through the prerequisites on the website of the university before you're applying to them. But as a general guide, they typically require the equivalent of a UK first class degree. So you can do your math and figure out what the equivalent is on our 7-point scale. And they also, in other cases, require that you be within the top 10 or 5% of your batch. Again, you can do the math depending on the size of your batch and figure out where you stand. It changes depending on where you're applying. It depends on the university you're applying to. I can speak to the prerequisites of the university I went to. But yeah, I mean, there isn't one kind of silver bullet that will give you admission or not give you admission. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And in fact, I would strongly recommend to not at least choose your internship based on what would get you an L.L.M. There are precious few opportunities you have in law schools to really step out and try something uncomfortable, something new, or actually just learn law in a practical setting, even if it's very ordinary, very sort of mainstream internship. So please don't choose on the basis of at least not till the very end. There are very, very few opportunities that law school gives you to step out of your bubble and challenge yourself. So don't think about L.L.Ms. Actually think about what would give you better exposure to practical life of law or whatever you enjoy.
Yeah, hi. I'm so sorry if this is a little repetitive, but I'm still a little confused about Jyotsna's question. So let's say there is a legal practitioner, let's say a partner in a law firm or somebody practicing in courts or practicing arbitration, who is taking a 1 trimester, a 3-month-long seminar course. Now, he's not a professor in NLS or a professor in any other university. First, would that person even qualify to write an academic LOR for our L.L.M applications? And second, would that person be preferred or would be preferable over a regularized professor in NLS if we have spent more time with this seminar professor and they know our personal work ethic better?
Okay, I'm hesitant to answer the eligibility question because I certainly cannot speak for any university. I'm not sure. You will have to go through the specific criteria. They have very long what they expect from their referees.
So in case you know, I'm focusing on Oxbridge here. So in case you know, since you did a Cambridge L.L.M, if you know their specifications.
In my case, my referees were both teaching at law school. All 3 of them were teaching at law school, very much. and still do. So I didn't really explore this option of having a seminar professor teach me. I guess it depends. You'd have to go through their requirements, what it says. I'm not very sure, rather unless you know.
Yeah, no, so I also applied in my fifth year to Oxbridge, and if I remember it correctly, at least one of my referees were like that, and my application was successful. So what I would generally say is that no, it's not ineligible for sure. Doesn't anyone who's teaching you a proper classroom course is not ineligible, is sort of eligible to write you an academic reference. It doesn't mean the person has to be career academic. That's not eligibility requirement. If someone has taught you, I would say single credit course generally discount because there are very few contact hours, but as you said, it was a proper trimester long course. It's okay if person is just a visiting faculty for 3 months teaching you a proper course, and you had, I think, as I said, the decision you have to make is who's likely to write you a better recommendation, and that's perfectly fine. Of course, if you have someone who's very, very, very well reputed, sort of distinguished professor in a university and who's likely to write you as good a record, then go with that person. But if it's a choice between content and person, I would say always go with the content, and that person is eligible for sure for writing your recommendation. Someone who might not be eligible is for writing an academic reference is, as I said, like someone who took a very short course, kind of 1 credit, or someone who has someone who didn't really take a course or took a training course, like a certificate course somewhere, and you attended it. No, don't ask them. But a proper law school course will definitely qualify for that.
Got it. I just have one small follow-up. Suppose we know fairly which area we want to specialize in when making our LLM applications. Should one or more of our academic references be a professor who has taught us in that specific area of specialization? Is that preferred or even necessary?
Okay, sorry, I'll go first on this. I would say not as much. So again, it comes down to the content. If someone can actually talk about your academic abilities over your academic ability in that particular subject, I would prefer someone who is likely to write a lot about my academic ability than about that particular subject, because of course that person is talking about my general sort of ability to be a good student, right, which I can then transfer to other subjects. But if say I have almost equally good records from two different professors, I'm likely to go more with the person who's closer to my area of interest. But if it comes down to, again, the content as to who's likely to sort of write a better, more detailed record, as opposed to just a constitutional law professor, and I'm applying for constitutional, and I know that that person is not likely to write as detailed a record, I'll go with the person who's likely to write a detailed record, even if that person is teaching, I don't know, securities law. Might not be connected at all, but I would still go with that person. But again, as like whatever we are saying here, when it comes to exactly what works in admission decisions is reverse engineering or received wisdom. We don't know. Maybe there is one professor who is so I'll tell you, because there's a lot of noise that works, right? And recently there's an interview of Cass Sunstein, who's a professor of law and economics at Harvard, and he's doing a study on whether AI should make all the admission decisions for that. It was just a sort of a provocative thought. And he interviewed a few admission decision makers, and they're like, a lot of these decisions have a lot of noise to that. They're just really random factors that work around, right? So it's very likely that someone sitting in the board might know that professor and like, oh, this professor has recommended the student, and I know this professor is a very distinguished person, whatever. And so let's take the student because this professor must have recommended someone good. But unless you have some very big name, I would rather go with someone who's writing. And even the big name is writing like a 4-line recommendation, I would not go with it, irrespective of how big name that is. It's all about the detailed content that really matters. So, sorry, just to finally answer, no, not necessary. Go with someone who will write about your ability in any area of law, than about very little about that particular area of law that you're interested in.
Yeah, I agree with him. My recommendations were written by people who didn't teach me the area I wanted to specialize in, and it was fine.
Got it. Thanks, guys.
Are there any other questions? I don't think so.
So if there's no other question, I guess like we can conclude here. Like, yeah, I guess this was a very productive session, and thank you guys so much.